The first victim probably doesn't even notice the bite. A flea, smaller than a grain of rice, pierces the skin of a farmer somewhere in Central Asia around 1346. Within days, his lymph nodes swell into grotesque bulges the size of eggs. Black bruises bloom across his skin like ink spreading through water. He's dead within a week, but the flea has already moved on, carrying billions of bacteria in its gut to the next warm body. This is how the world ends for half of Europe. The Black Death will kill so many people that corpses pile in streets like firewood. Entire villages vanish overnight, and survivors will question whether humanity itself has a future. But the plague doesn't start as a pandemic. It starts as a supply chain problem. Trade routes connecting east and west are the arteries of medieval commerce, pumping silk, spices, and silver across thousands of miles. Merchant caravans crawl along the Silk Road, stopping at bustling trade cities where goods change hands and cultures collide. These same routes become highways for death itself. The bacterium responsible is Yersinia pestis, and it's been lurking in rodent populations across Asia for centuries, occasionally spilling over into human communities, but never spreading far. Until now. Climate shifts push infected rodent colonies closer to human settlements. Rats hitch rides on grain shipments. Fleas nestle into fabric bales. Every transaction becomes a potential death sentence. By 1347, the disease reaches the Crimean port city of Kaffa, where Genoese merchants are trapped inside during a siege by Mongol forces. The Mongols, watching their own soldiers drop dead from mysterious swellings, catapult plague-ridden corpses over the city walls in one of history's first documented cases of biological warfare. The tactic backfires spectacularly. Merchants fleeing the siege carry the infection onto ships bound for Europe. Imagine you're standing on the docks of Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. 12 ships limp into harbor, their decks slick with blood and waste. Most sailors are already dead, slumped over oars or sprawled across cargo. The few still breathing are covered in black boils that leak pus and blood. Port authorities order the ships away immediately, but it's already too late. The invisible army has made landfall. Within months, the plague transforms from a distant rumor into an inescapable nightmare. It moves faster than any military campaign, spreading through Italy, France, and Spain with terrifying efficiency. Cities that took centuries to build empty in weeks. Florence loses half its population. Venice buries so many dead, they run out of consecrated ground and start dumping bodies in lagoons. The symptoms are biblical in their horror. It starts with flu-like fever and chills, easily mistaken for common illness. Then the buboes appear, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits and neck that turn black and rupture. Some victims develop the pneumonic form, coughing up blood and infecting everyone nearby through airborne droplets. Others suffer the septicemic variant, where bacteria flood the bloodstream, turning extremities gangrenous black before death arrives within hours. Medieval medicine is utterly helpless. Doctors wear beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing bad smells cause disease. They prescribe bloodletting, which only weakens patients further. Some recommend bathing in urine or placing dead animals on buboes to draw out infection. Nothing works because nobody understands what they're fighting. Germ theory won't exist for another 500 years. The speed of death breaks every social structure. Parents abandon sick children. Priests refuse last rites. Entire monasteries die within days, taking centuries of accumulated knowledge with them. In some regions, so many clergy perish that untrained survivors perform mass burials without proper rituals, convinced they're living through the apocalypse. Survivors search desperately for explanations. Some blame astrological alignments, convinced a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars poisoned the air. Others point to earthquakes releasing toxic vapors from the earth. The most popular theory blames corrupt air, or miasma. leading people to burn aromatic woods and avoid bathing, which, ironically, makes the flea problem worse. Jewish communities face horrific persecution as rumors spread that they poisoned wells. Entire villages are massacred despite the obvious fact that plague kills Jews just as readily as Christians. Flagellants march through towns, whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. Mass hysteria becomes as contagious as the disease itself. But here's what makes this plague different from any disaster before or since. It doesn't just kill and move on. The Black Death settles into Europe like an unwanted guest who refuses to leave, returning in waves for the next 4 centuries. Each outbreak claims thousands more lives, preventing populations from recovering. And the truly terrifying part? The initial wave we've just described, the one that arrives in 1347, is only the beginning. What happens next will reshape civilization itself in ways nobody could predict. The survivors face a world that makes no sense, fields full of wheat rot unharvested because everyone who knew how to work them is dead. Livestock wander through empty villages, bellowing for owners who will never return. Tools rust in abandoned workshops. Ships sit idle in harbors because entire crews vanished within a week. Then something unexpected happens. The few who remain suddenly find themselves valuable in ways their parents never were. A peasant who survived now works land that once supported 5 families. He can demand higher wages because lords desperate to get crops harvested have no choice but to pay. A craftsman who once competed with dozens of others now names his price. The fundamental equation of medieval economics, endless cheap labor serving a tiny elite, has shattered completely. Lords respond exactly how you'd expect, the powerful to react when workers gain leverage. They pass laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels and restricting peasant movement. England's Statute of Laborers of 1351 makes it illegal to pay field workers more than they earned before the plague. The penalty for refusing work at the mandated rate? Branding with a hot iron. These laws fail spectacularly. You can't legislate away supply and demand, especially when half your enforcement officers are dead too. Peasants ignore the statutes, lords bid against each other for workers, and the entire feudal system starts cracking at its foundations. Some serfs simply walk away from their ancestral lands, knowing the lord lacks the manpower to chase them down. The plague doesn't just redistribute wealth, it redistributes power. And that terrifies the establishment more than the disease ever did. Meanwhile, medicine begins its long, painful crawl toward actual understanding. Doctors notice that plague spreads faster in crowded cities than sparse countryside. They observe it jumping between households in contact, but skipping isolated farms. These patterns don't fit the miasma theory, the idea that bad air alone causes disease. Italian physicians start documenting case histories with unprecedented detail. They note how victims often handled goods from infected areas or cared for sick family members. Some even recommend quarantine, though they don't understand why it works. Venice establishes the first formal quarantine system in 1374, forcing arriving ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before unloading. The word quarantine itself comes from 40 giorni, Italian for 40 days. But here's the cruel irony. These early public health measures sometimes work, which convinces authorities they're fighting a purely human problem that human solutions can fix. Nobody suspects the actual culprit, because rats are everywhere, completely normal parts of medieval life. The real killer, Yersinia pestis bacteria, remains invisible for 5 more centuries. The plague reshapes more than economics and medicine. It transforms how people think about everything. Before 1347, European art focused heavily on eternal paradise and divine glory. Afterward, images of death flood every medium. Dance macabre paintings show skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike, reminding viewers that death plays no favorites. Tomb sculptures shift from serene figures in prayer to rotting corpses crawling with worms. This isn't morbid fascination. It's trauma expressed through art. An entire generation watched the world's population drop by perhaps a third, maybe more. Some regions lost 70% of their people. That kind of loss doesn't just hurt, it fundamentally alters how survivors see reality itself. The church, which promised protection through prayer and proper devotion, failed utterly. Priests died at higher rates than laypeople because they administered last rites to the infected. Monasteries, supposedly protected by holy devotion, were devastated. This doesn't destroy faith, not immediately, but it plants seeds of doubt that will flower during the Reformation 2 centuries later. Universities lose entire faculties overnight. The University of Cambridge suspends operations completely in 1349. Oxford sees its student population collapse, but the survivors inherit libraries and positions they never could have accessed before. A middle-class merchant's son can now attend university because so many aristocratic students are dead. Social mobility, previously almost non-existent, becomes suddenly possible. The plague even changes dinner. Spice imports explode as Europeans develop a taste for heavily seasoned food, partly to mask the smell of meat that's going bad faster in understaffed kitchens. Sugar consumption rises dramatically. Wine production shifts as depopulated regions can't maintain their vineyards and new areas fill the gap. The entire agricultural map of Europe gets redrawn. Women gain unexpected opportunities too. Widows inherit businesses and run them successfully. Some guilds, desperate for workers, start accepting female apprentices for the first time. These gains are limited and often temporary, but they crack open doors that had been welded shut for centuries. Every assumption about how society should work is now up for debate. The old order survived on the belief that everyone had their fixed place in God's hierarchy. But when plague kills nobles and peasants with equal enthusiasm, that hierarchy starts looking less divine and more arbitrary. The world that emerges from this catastrophe won't look anything like the one that entered it. But first, it has to survive several more waves of death. The plague returns in 1361, then again in 1369, and keeps coming back every decade or so for the next 3 centuries. Each wave kills fewer people than the Black Death, but that's small comfort when your child dies in an outbreak your grandmother survived. Europe develops a grim routine. Cities appoint plague doctors who wear those famous bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and flowers, convinced that bad air causes disease. The long-waxed coats and gloves actually help a little, not because of medieval medical theory, but purely by accident, creating a barrier between doctor and infected fleas. Towns build pest houses where the infected are locked away to die. These aren't hospitals in any real sense. They're warehouses for the doomed, built far from city centers so the disease doesn't spread. Families mark their doors with red crosses when someone inside falls sick, warning neighbors to stay away. In London, they start keeping weekly death counts, publishing bills of mortality that let people track which parishes are currently plagued. It's data-driven public health, born from desperation. The economic transformation accelerates with each new outbreak. Labor shortages become the new normal. A farmhand who would have worked for pennies in 1340 can now demand real wages and better conditions in 1380. Lords who refuse lose their workers to neighbors offering better deals. The manorial system, which survived barbarian invasions and countless wars, crumbles under demographic pressure. Serfs buy their freedom or simply walk away, knowing desperate landlords elsewhere will hire them with no questions asked. England tries fighting economics with legislation. The Statute of Laborers in 1351 attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid workers from seeking better employment. It fails completely. You can't legislate away supply and demand. Workers ignore the law. Employers desperate for labor ignore the law. and the whole system collapses into something resembling a free labor market. Similar laws across Europe meet similar fates. This creates rage among the nobility who've lost control. That anger explodes in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when English workers march on London demanding an end to serfdom and fair wages. The revolt is crushed brutally, its leaders executed, but the underlying reality doesn't change. Workers have leverage now. The genie isn't going back in the bottle. Technology accelerates to compensate for missing humans. Mills become more sophisticated, doing work that used to require dozens of people. Mining techniques improve dramatically. Printing technology advances, culminating in Gutenberg's press around 1440. These innovations might have happened eventually, but labor scarcity makes them urgent rather than interesting. Necessity drives invention faster than curiosity ever could. The plague also accidentally sparks medical progress, though not how you'd expect. Doctors are completely wrong about causes and treatments, but they start doing autopsies more frequently, trying to understand what's happening inside plague victims. This hands-on investigation of human anatomy, previously considered vaguely heretical, becomes acceptable because the crisis demands answers. These dissections don't help plague victims, but they build anatomical knowledge that later physicians will use to actually understand how bodies work. Jewish communities face horrific persecution as conspiracy theories spread that they're poisoning wells to cause plague. Pogroms sweep through Europe. Entire communities are massacred by mobs, convinced that eliminating Jews will stop the disease. It doesn't, obviously, because bacteria don't care about religion, but this doesn't stop the violence. Some rulers try protecting Jewish populations, not from moral conviction, but because Jewish merchants and moneylenders are economically valuable. The plague reveals the best and worst of human nature simultaneously. By 1400, a new Europe is emerging. It's smaller, stranger, and somehow more dynamic than what came before. Cities that survived the plague are wealthier per capita than they were in 1347. Peasants eat more meat because there's more pasture land per person. Wages are higher. Social mobility is real. The Renaissance is beginning in Italy, funded partly by plague-era wealth concentration and enabled by the breakdown of old certainties. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it shattered a worldview. Medieval Europeans believed their society reflected divine order, unchanging and unchangeable. The plague proved that entire civilizations could transform within a single generation. That knowledge, once learned, couldn't be forgotten. When Martin Luther challenges church authority in 1517, he's building on doubts the plague planted. When explorers sail to unknown continents, they're chasing opportunities the plague created. The bacteria that caused all this keeps circulating in rodent populations worldwide. Modern antibiotics can cure it easily now, but Yersinia pestis still infects hundreds of people annually. The difference is, we finally understand what we're fighting. It only took us 500 years and roughly 200 million deaths to figure it out. The medieval world entered 1347 with certainty about how everything worked. It emerged from the Black Death with questions about everything. That shift, from unshakable faith in fixed hierarchies to skepticism about received wisdom, might be the plague's most lasting legacy. The bacteria didn't just reshuffle who held power. It proved that power itself could be reshuffled, that the natural order wasn't natural at all, just temporary. Every revolution, every reform movement, every challenge to authority that followed, built on ground the plague softened. We remember it as humanity's deadliest disaster, and it was. But disasters don't just destroy. Sometimes they clear space for what comes next.